Welcome to Community Q&A number 6, the Let's Ask Max segment. Today we have a handful of questions submitted by users of the Weightlifting.AI, which is why we are delivering it to you, and hopefully we can provide some informative information that will help you improve your technique or your training. Max, before we get into it, any words?
No, that's excellent description of what we're doing.
So the first question is from devin.bell. He says, do you believe it is ever advantageous to move your feet in the squat to more closely resemble the snatch or clean receiving position? I've been experimenting with squatting and a snatch width to improve my bottom position.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I don't think it's going to be mind-blowing difference. I think if you had a really wide squat stance and you moved it in a little bit, you might see a benefit. Or if your stance was so different than your snatch or clean, it might make a difference. But in practical, experience, I've not seen something like that was like massively different, where like somebody changed their squat technique and it had a huge impact on their lift.
Right. I almost wonder too, so imagine we ask this question a little bit differently, because this is what John North would say, is that he would squat really narrow because it mimics the pulling stance.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like, so the example there is like, it mimics the pulling stance, but the bar is on your upper back.
Right.
So it's like, the question is like, we like to pick and choose things that sound good. So it's like, it mimics this or that, but it's also like, it's very different. So I think from a general standpoint, like, increasing back squat, increasing your squat strength in a way that's meaningful to your lifts is probably the sole important goal of squatting versus like having a huge technical transference.
Yeah, it's like almost like the deviation between positions is much smaller than doing the position that's going to put the most weight on the bar and being able to maximize that. Because if you say, okay, I lose 5% when I move my feet to a different position, if you squat 250 instead of 200, it's like that 5% is a much smaller trade-off.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true, right? We know the average weight of the bar, like as that increases, you're gonna get stronger, and that's like our primary mechanism for increasing strength versus like having a super high transference, which I don't think is the case. You can say those words, but that doesn't mean they're true, right? It's really high transference, it's just limited to what it's gonna be. So you're not gonna probably find a way to like maximize that to some degree that really has a meaningful impact outside of being way far from the technique that's transferable.
And then you have to think about total training too, because squats aren't done in isolation as like a singular thing. You have your snatches, your cleans, imagine you have belt squats or front squats or some other pause squat, overhead squat, and it's like where are your feet in those positions, because that is training that can kind of add up and make up for maybe having a different squat stance width than what you would normally use for everything else. So it almost like helps to facilitate some sort of transfer.
Yeah.
Cool. The next question is from damufunman. He has 2 paragraphs, so this is probably a pretty beefy one. What is the strategy or strategies used by the AI if a lift isn't progressing? Do the overall intensities or volumes get adjusted, other variations tried, different loading protocols possibly with the same average intensities, etc.? This seems to be a big part of the individualization process. Will the AI be sophisticated enough to do that? Or is that getting into one-on-one coaching territory? And then we'll do the other part after this.
Yes, I mean all of those things are built into the system, so that as you train, the AI will adapt intensity and volume to your results, right? So if you're seeing a training cycle and there's no progress, then there should be adjustment of those things. Within the training cycle, there'll be adjustment as well. So the goal is to always be driving towards that end, to the point where like as you train and as you do these things, like you're training a hang snatch or something and there's no progress, other variations are tried, the intensity increases, the distribution of intensity changes as well. So it moves from a lower number of lighter sessions to a high number of lighter sessions to a higher number of heavier sessions. and then overall volume changes. So yeah, it manipulates those variables as well. The goal is to get to a point where it's doing a better job of that on a subtle level than a coach would, because it can make more finite adjustments, as it sees trends, or as we start to see the ability to okay, these people in these populations tend to do this, we're going to make movements toward that already. So that's the goal.
Yeah, and the second question, somewhat related, at least according to damufunman, if programmed 5 squat singles at 90% is problematic, for example, there's some knee pain, is doing something like a heavier top single than 4 back offs at 85% or lower to bring the repeats to lower percentage something the AI can do? Would this have a meaningful difference in training effect? And before you answer for the AI, I will say I have someone who's currently experiencing some sort of low back discomfort, and she would not want to do back squats, and she would ask, okay, if I do front squats, what should I do? I would just take the average intensity for all of the sets, give her 2% up and down, and then say, hey, do 4 triples at 78 to 82%, kind of doing what he said here with that heavier top set and then lower back offs, to where it kind of pulls the average weight on the bar to around the same point.
Yeah. Currently it can't do that. It's not going to give you a top single then back off sets. That's definitely something that's on the drawing board to develop, so there's a session structure like that. But like Josh said, I would say his answer is good enough for us, whether that's meaningful.
Do you think that if someone like Justin, who knows programming pretty well, wants to do that, it would make sense to just go into the session and do that?
Yeah, you could just adjust it. You could just do a top single and then reduce the next sets to do what you want. You're going to have to disregard some of the auto regulation stuff, but yeah, you certainly could.
Okay. The next question comes from Dylan. Do you have any tips for those wanting to give form check advice in the community? The advice is obviously limited given the difficulty of analyzing a lift from a single video or angle. And is it detrimental if there's differing advice? So any tips for those wanting to give form check advice in the community?
I don't think I think it's a good idea for everyone to try and give form checks. I mean, that's the purpose of the community. If there's 10,000 people in the community someday, hopefully, then it's not going to be Josh. I mean, if it is, then this is the last time we'll see him alive. Yes, I mean, the goal would be give advice as to what you're capable of giving, right? If you're not 100% sure what's wrong, you can state your opinion as, I'm not sure, but this is what I see. I think that's totally fine. I think that the goal is for everybody to get better. So if you're giving advice and you're watching lifts and analyzing them, you're going to improve your own lifting as well, because you're going to start to think about the lifts from an external position and just start to think about how they're performed. That will definitely improve your own lifting skill. So I would say for sure. As far as guidelines, I would say, just know what, try to get a sense of what you know and what you don't know and what you're comfortable doing. You don't have to give a ton of information, right? You can give whatever information you feel is going to be beneficial. And I would say just be polite and courteous with that.
And I think the biggest thing is being able to kind of Occam's razor it down to what are the bigger problems and what are the things that are less meaningful, and not just analyzing it and giving a detailed analysis of the lift, because that's not what helps generally. It's more here's where the biggest problem is, here's how you're going to correct it, and here's why you would correct it. So being able to single in on that stuff's important. And then if it's detrimental if there's differing advice, I would say if it's they're completely contrasting, that's detrimental. But if you don't finish the extension at the top and you point that out and I say, okay, but you don't follow the bar up with your arms, I don't think those two are inherently detrimental. But if it's you're pulling too long, and then it's you're not pulling long enough, it's obviously not helpful.
Yeah, it's tough to know too, right? If somebody is wrong giving advice or technique analysis that's incorrect, I think it's fine to disagree as long as you state that initially, that you think this is maybe not correct and this is what you see. I think that's totally fair, right? I think because it's very easy for someone to believe they're right and be the most outspoken person in the room, which is oftentimes really common.
Yeah.
But make sure that you're not just, throwing advice out there. It's like, just, I think, be generally courteous about what you're doing. Explain your position, what you think, and make an argument for it.
Well, there's no value judgment with a technical error. It's not like you're a worse person because you don't.
No.
I mean, the way you would frame it and the way you talked to me last night about my extension is one thing, but generally, it's you're not a bad person if you don't use your arms correctly, even though
you've been told to many times.
The next question is from Find Me Under the Bar. Cardio for weightlifting on training or off days, low intensity, steady state, or higher intensity. So there are 4 different questions, so let's just go one by one.
I would say, cardio for weightlifting is fine, and in general, I would say low intensity, steady state is probably your best option. The main thing I would say, like a lot of people will say high intensity and mean CrossFit, and I would say if you're doing a lot of CrossFit stuff, it depends on your goals. If your goals are, I want to feel really good and do a lot of cardio and do weightlifting, that's awesome. That's a great goal. So understand that there's some non-optimal stuff going on there as far as becoming the best weightlifter you could. As far as high intensity stuff like CrossFit, if that's what you're talking about, then I would avoid barbell stuff. Try to limit it to just more basic, simple movements, bodyweight movements. Is best. And then running in general, I would avoid in lieu of something that's less impactful.
Yeah, and I think the heart of this question is, what are the adaptations that you would gain from cardio, and how do you manage fatigue to have them interfere least with training, and then is that more beneficial than not doing it? And I think there could be a benefit. I think the bigger thing is just managing fatigue, so keeping the cardio sessions far enough away from training sessions, making sure they're not too much, too voluminous or too intense. So I would say, start with low intensity, steady state. I mean, I personally like to go for an hour and a half or 2 hour walk once or twice a day. So I'd recommend starting there, and then on the other end you have CrossFit training immediately before workouts, which are obviously detrimental. But if you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think you can kind of craft a program with it. The next question is, now that the option to swap major exercises has been added, when would you advise swapping exercises?
When you don't want the exercise that's listed.
That's great.
That's really the reality. It's I would say the major benefit of this feature is that people can select an exercise that on the top of this list is maybe better suited to what they feel they want to work on or need to work on. So if you have, a hang snatch below the knee and you feel I should really be doing a deficit snatch, then you can swap that out. The other probably more popular use cases are things where you might not have access to the equipment, or you just might not like that movement. It doesn't feel comfortable to you. It's just something you dislike because, for whatever reason, then you can move it. As far as choosing exercises that maybe are better suited to developing technique or these things, if they're recommended by somebody on the forum or by one of us, that's a great reason for it to exist, a great option for it. So, in some cases you might be doing something, the system has determined you're going to do these exercises for your snatch, but a coach says, hey, you should really do no hook, no feet, because that's going to be a better option for you, because that's a bigger problem. Then that's a great reason to switch, and that's the main reason why it exists.
Yeah, and that was perfectly answered. So we'll go to the third question. Are there any interesting weightlifting parameters which can predict performance and which are monitored by the Weightlifting.AI?
The amount of weight you can snatch and clean and jerk for 1 rep without straps.
He said interesting though.
I think those are interesting. We spend our whole lives in the sport, and that's the only thing there is in the sport. The average intensity of the training load is probably the most significant driver, as well as the number of 90% lifts in training.
And then I would say, from a technical perspective, if you're looking at bar displacement at certain parts of the lift, generally weightlifting performance is going to improve if displacement is lessened away from a certain point.
Yeah.
Off the floor, at the knee, the contact point, pulling overhead.
Yeah. Not monitored by the AI. But
currently.
Yes. Yeah. Currently. But yeah, I mean, like there's a lot of factors. I think the key is really distilling it down to the most important factors, right? The things that we know have a significant impact on results, and monitoring those and addressing that.
And thinking about the potency of that parameter. So if one thing like the snatch with no straps, competition style, that tells you exactly where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's one thing that can directly predict performance because it is the performance. And then you would say, okay, well, if we do a hang snatch and block snatch, like maybe that gives you an idea.
Yeah.
And then to the point some guy made about pull-ups, he said, should I do more pull-ups? I think it would help performance and keep me healthy. And it's like the pull-up has such a low correlation to the lift. You would need like a bunch of different exercises or movements or close variations. And then you kind of gain a picture of where your performance is at. So it's got to kind of fulfill the criteria of training, which is it specific? And the degree to which it's specific will tell you the degree to which it can predict performance. And
it's also important to note that like the qualification of the athlete has a big impact.
Yeah, it's huge.
If you look at like a total tangent, if you look at like hammer throwers in the United States, hammer throwing is not done in high school in the US. And so you get a lot of hammer throwers in college. When they start in college, there's a really fast acceleration to increasing the speed or increasing the distance they throw the hammer by making them as strong as possible. And so you'd say at surface value, or face value, like getting really, really strong improves your hammer throw a lot. But it's because the athletes aren't that high qualified. They're just late into the sport, and when you make them strong really quickly, you get a big result out of them, but they end up limiting their total results because they never trained the right thing. So having a system that is purely just looking at the correlation of what's happening this second and disregarding what we know about the process of training isn't necessarily ideal. We want to have a system of training that we know is going to maximize results as far down the line as we can. So, based on qualification, training should look a little bit different. Taking a brand new lifter and making them as strong as you possibly can right away is not necessarily the best pathway to becoming a really good lifter 5 or 10 years into your career. It could very easily just become this thing where you just do huge amounts of training volume, get to the highest results you're going to get to really quickly, and then because you didn't develop the right speed qualities or the right technique, you're basically limited in your total ability after that. So something to be aware of.
Well, and someone who's a complete beginner, if their technique hasn't solidified in a way that is repeatable, the performance might change dramatically. It might get a lot stronger, a lot better. But because their performance of the snatch is unstable, they can't express it.
Yep.
So it does depend on a couple more factors than that. And the most important question, according to Find Me Under the Bar, is what's your favorite weightlifting meme page? Heels over toes?
I don't even remember all the names of them.
4 white lights?
Axmeda, yeah. Tingus Pingus, I believe is his name.
I think there's a Chungus one too.
Chungus Taladze, yeah. Chungus Taladze.
Okay. Dylan says, question for Josh. In some of your snatch videos...
Dylan, you're double dipping on questions here.
I mean, I'm sure he's down a little bit further too. In some of your snatch videos on Instagram, the bar doesn't land overhead straight and the bar begins to rotate. Interested in knowing what your journey is to correct it. My only intent to correct it...
No intent.
...is by not twisting. Honestly, when I catch it, I just think about catching it correctly.
Josh's answer to that question is, how much can you fucking snatch? And if it's more than Josh, then good on you.
But yeah, I mean, that's really it. Max gave me some snatch grip presses. If I were to program for it, I would maybe do snatch balance. But other than that, it's just doing it correctly. I had this girl for like 2 years. She would rotate in helicopter when she'd catch a snatch. And one day I was like, you ever think about not doing that? And she's like, I didn't even know I did it to that degree or it was that bad. And I was like, okay, well, try not to do it. And she instantly fixed it. And I remember yelling at her a lot after that.
That's the greatest cue in the world, is try it do it correctly.
Try
You
to
don't
do it.
know. If someone walks in the gym and you say do it correctly and they do it correctly, your whole job is way easier after that. And you never try that until years down the
You just
road.
coach yourself out of a job though.
Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe.
You say, can you do that incorrectly real quick?
Yeah.
Definitely
Yeah.
need me. Yeah. Okay, then queenmypawn says, for filming weightlifting from the front point of view, should I use a linear or wide with fisheye point of view? I'm using a GoPro 9 Black and wide eye looks better, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
I don't know. Use whatever gives people the most clarity in the video.
Yeah, whatever's the most clarity, front side.
Yeah.
I think it's like 45-degree angle is generally the best,
yeah.
for everything. Torerik says, what's the minimum amount of training an intermediate lifter can get away with to maintain strength for weightlifting? Example, if I wanted to spend 3 to 6 months to train for a marathon or something.
Two interesting questions, because the first, you're asking a question we have no context for. We don't know what intermediate is or what level of strength you have or your training history, so that's really difficult to answer. But then the second, thing you've thrown in there is train for a marathon, which is going to directly compete for your weightlifting success. It's gonna really be a challenge to maintain that. I would say that if doing a marathon was really important, I would do my training for that and focus on that. And when I had energy and time that didn't interfere with that, I'd do some snatch and clean and jerk training, to maintain the skill and technique, but largely wouldn't try to necessarily maintain that to any degree, right? It could potentially just be a frustrating endeavor in which you're doing too much training and negatively impacting one or the other, or it's just something you're just putting yourself at potentially risk of injury. But yeah, it's going to be tough to maintain that kind of program.
Yeah, I think it really depends on, kind of your point, what an intermediate lifter is, because if you can get stronger, like we know with endurance events, being stronger actually improves performance because it requires less work per step, basically because you have more of a force reserve. So each step is a little bit easier. So it just gives you like more room to run, basically. So I would say if you can get stronger, maybe do weightlifting less frequently as a way to maintain the technique, and then focus on putting more resources towards like very simple movements like the squat or the deadlift, because it's not complicated, it's not ballistic, it's straightforward. So I would maybe, instead of just like thinking of weightlifting as like this big broad thing that's maintained, you would say, how do I change the emphasis of my training to do less weightlifting to maintain like snatch, clean specifically, and then maximize other areas of it, which would be like pure strength stuff. But yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to say for an intermediate lifter. So maybe in the next Q&A can drop some more details and we can go into a bit more. So Justin also comes back for a second question and says, is there a good way to use velocity with the AI? I would guess using the light's rating and RIR to reflect the velocity. Potentially you could do something like that. I would say if you're tracking the velocity of the bar and basically using that as a proxy for the ratings, right? That's the only way you could input that data is through the ratings that exist in the app. I would say that's probably your if you really are dead set on using velocity with the app, that's probably the way you'd have to do it, is basically use the velocity as a proxy, because there's no way to input like a specific velocity number. Well, you would have to know a lot, right?
Yeah.
Because you'd have to know the intent of the squatting portion of the session.
Well, even the lifts, right? You'd look at the intensity, I guess, and try to gauge where that's at, gauge what it's kind of tough. It's tough to say, I think that ultimately, the goal of that would be to improve your training, right? Would be to say the velocity included with the AI would be to improve your training. I don't know if implementation of it would have that effect, right?
Yeah. I think it's the same way. Maybe at some point there's some parallel feature built in, but using the lights and then RIR is just gonna be. I know it's gonna be really weird to say that's like a 5 RIR.
Yeah.
It's this velocity.
Yeah.
But because you're going for a certain training effect, or you're trying to get a certain weight on the bar, so it'd just be hard to kind of triangulate those things. And the last question from Tmeissner says, how does the AI decide if it needs to tone it down with volume or increase it? Is it per exercise or total average white lights RIR? For example, what happens if you're doing very well in either snatch or clean and jerk while doing poorly in the other?
The cumulative effects are going to be based on like readiness, right? So if you're reporting really low readiness on stuff, you're going to get reductions. That's the basic foundation of it.
Okay.
Right? If you're getting lots of really bad light ratings, there'd be adjustments as well. But you'd have to be getting a cumulative number of things that are really bad for that to happen. It's difficult to say if you're putting in ratings because it's subjective. If you're putting lots of reds in, like lots of 2 reds or 1 red, is it because you're overly fatigued, or is it because you're, you're just a harsh critic?
Yeah.
The other side's true too. If we have somebody who's in there and they're missing lifts but putting in multiple whites, right? 2 whites on misses, a triple that you missed 2 of the reps on. Is that the case? So it's better to use something like readiness and see if there's a cumulative effect where you're continually, getting worse and worse and more tired.
And then it says, for example, what happens if you're doing very well in one lift and poorly in the other? If that were like quantifiable, like the snatches going up, it would just change the amount of training for the other, or?
As far as changing, like shifting volume, it won't do that right now.
Okay.
There's nothing to say we're going to switch volume from one to the other because you're doing poorly. The thing we don't want to have is a ping pong effect where you're just bouncing around between 2 points because you're not able to actually move forward with one.
Yeah, but say at the end of a program, you put in new maxes for one lift and the other one's still low, would that then adapt to the next program?
If one is still low, then the program would shift, would emphasize that exercise,
Okay, so like on a macro scale, it does change volumes or, cool. Well, that was the last question. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and gained a lot from it. If you have any other questions, make sure you respond in the next Q&A thread, which will go up. That will be number 7. Max, any last words?
Nope.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. We will catch you guys next time.